Hello, I'm Dr. Wilfred Graves Jr. Welcome to part 2 of my 2-part video study guide for Autopsy of a Deceased Church by Thom Rainer. This book offers various symptoms of unhealthy churches and several reasons for the demise of local congregations. In this short video, we will cover some highlights from the material in chapters 8 through 14. Chapters 8 and 9, the short-term pastor and the prayerless church. Chapter 8 is entitled Pastoral Tenure Decreases. One possible symptom of a church in trouble is the mutual frustration of the pastor and the congregation with each other. As frustration on either side or on both sides increases, the length of time that pastors serves grows shorter. Sometimes pastors leave churches because of various conflicts and challenges long before they've had the opportunity to exert productive leadership or institute lasting change. The result is that the church fails to fully benefit from the gifts of that pastor. Chapter 9 is entitled, The Church Rarely Prayed Together. The main idea here is that all churches need to come to realize or rediscover the power of corporate prayer. It is often the case that members of dying churches simply stop praying together. Instead of praying without ceasing, they are ceasing to pray. However, when a local church is engaged in passionate and meaningful prayer, that prayer becomes both the cause and the result of greater church health. 2 questions for you to consider and discuss after reading chapters 8 and 9 are as follows. Number 1, why do declining and dying churches often see shorter pastoral tenure? And number 2, when is your most recent memory of a dynamic corporate prayer time taking place in your church? Hopefully, praying together in power is a regular part of your experience. Chapters 10 and 11, a church without purpose and a church with facilities as its purpose. Chapter 10 is entitled, The Church Had No Clear Purpose. Some churches lose a sense of their purpose over time. The purpose of the church is to proclaim the gospel and live according to the principles of the gospel. The gospel, of course, is the good news of who Jesus is and what Jesus has accomplished. In Philippians chapter 1, Paul said that he prayed for the church because of their partnership in the gospel. Let me read verses 3 through 6. There, Paul writes, Every time I think of you, I give thanks to my God. Whenever I pray, I make my requests for all of you with joy, for you have been my partners in spreading the good news about Christ from the time you first heard it until now. And I'm certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. The church to whom Paul writes remained consistent in the task of spreading the good news. Spreading the good news was their task, and it is still the church's primary task today. A local church should be more than a social club or an arm of politics or a building. A local church is where the gospel is proclaimed. When we stop preaching and living out the good news, spiritual death is inevitable. Chapter 11 is entitled, The Church Obsesses Over Its Facilities. Focusing too much on the physical building is just one of many examples of how a local church sometimes loses a sense of its purpose over time. Yet, shouldn't we be focusing more on building lives than on building and maintaining church facilities? That's something to think about. After reading chapters 10 and 11, please also consider the following two questions. Number one, how do routine and tradition get in the way of a church fulfilling her purpose? And number two, explain the difference between a church being a good steward over physical things versus the church becoming obsessed and idolatrous about them. What are some examples of each? Chapters 12, 13, and 14. Sick, very sick, and dying. Possible responses. Rainer conceives of the first 11 chapters as a wake-up call. In the last 3 chapters, he gives a brief overview of 3 categories of churches. These categories are sick, very sick, and dying. Sick churches are churches with noticeable problems and may have experienced some areas of decline in recent years. These churches need to get back to their primary purpose, the preaching of the gospel, and they need to move away from being self-centered. Now, very sick churches, on the other hand, usually have been seeing steady decline for 5 or 10 years or more. They may have major money problems and are seeing mass exits of people. These churches require radical change. They cannot thrive by doing things the same way. They can't keep appealing to the same people with the same attitudes, with the same approaches, and the same mindsets. They must commit themselves humbly to prayer and obedience to the Great Commission. They must do a complete turnaround. Finally, when everything has been done and there's no hope for a church to continue to keep its doors open, that church can still honor God by supporting other thriving congregations. A congregation, for example, could donate its building to a new church, or it could also become a campus of an existing church. So we're talking about a church merger. In both instances, the church building would continue to represent a gospel presence in that community. So please think about the following 2 questions as you complete your reading of chapters 12, 13, and 14. The first question is, what are some differences between a sick church and a very sick church? And number 2, what are some ways to give away your church? Well, that concludes my video. I hope that you have found this 2-part study guide to be helpful to you. God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you in the live class. Bye-bye.